Welcome to the Blood Red channel as we bring you the latest Bottom Line podcast with Dave Powell. The latest episode was recorded prior to Sunday's events at Old Trafford, which saw Liverpool's clash with Manchester United postponed following supporter protests against the Glazer family's ownership. Staying on the theme of the failed European Super League, the latest episode sees Dave catch up with economist and football author Stefan Szymanski to get into the continuing fallout surrounding the Super League.
Hello and welcome to the latest Bottom Line podcast from the Blood Red channel with myself, Dave Powell, business and football writer at the Liverpool ECHO. Over the past few weeks, we've covered a wide-ranging number of topics on here, from the Jerry Cardinale and Redbird Capital investment in Fenway Sports Group to the doomed European Super League plot, to this week's announcement of the annual accounts from Liverpool that showed their £46 million loss. The European Super League plan dominated the agenda last week after the failed plot by the biggest 12 clubs in Europe to form their own breakaway competition. Liverpool owners FSG have come under heavy fire for their significant part in the plans. And while John W. Henry's display of contrition last week may have appeased some, the latest misstep could be one too many for some fans. But what does the future of the game look like? And what do the role of the likes of FSG have to play in it? Joining me today to give us insight is someone well-versed in the economics of football, the Stephen J. Galletti Professor of Sport Management at the University of Michigan, Stefan Szymanski. A prolific author on the subject of football finance, Stefan has written books including Money on Football, Soccernomics, and Winners and Losers, the Business Strategy of Football. Stefan, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Pleasure to be with you.
Fantastic. It's been quite the week for football. It's probably a week unlike any other, certainly that we've seen in the last couple of decades. And what's been your take on it, of what we've seen these past few days?
Well, I think two things. So firstly, I should say I wrote an article with Tom Hohen 22 years ago talking about the inevitability of a European Super League. So I've had a long-term sort of interest in this. And the argument then is the argument still today, which is not about the clubs, but about the players. Fans like to see the best players come up against each other. That's the nature of sports. Why we like the World Cup and the Olympics, or one of the reasons anyway. And so what the Super League was offering was more opportunities for that. And don't think about the clubs, but think about the matchups. Think about, Mbappe versus Kane, or Salah versus Messi, or think of any of those kind of matchups. And there are dozens you could think of that would be really exciting. And that would create a global audience. And that's why the bankers, JP Morgan, were willing to put up 3.25 billion euros to bankroll this, because they knew they'd get their money back because there's pent-up demand. But the second thing, and as someone who's moved to teaching about sports in the United States, I can speak to this. It's the complete lack of appreciation amongst Americans of the significance of the promotion and relegation system, the significance of the pyramid, the significance of entry on sporting merit. And, I try to explain this to my students here in the US, and frankly, they struggle to get what the big deal is. They sort of say, and they're certainly adamant it could never work in the US. And they also think it sounds a bit crazy as far as they're concerned. So that which is why, the owners miscalculated so badly, because they just could not believe that this matters so much to the fans. And yet, obviously, it does.
Was this a need or a want? For the likes of Real Madrid and Barcelona, it could be argued that it was a need greater than some of the others, because we've seen the level of debt. Obviously, in football, having debt's one thing if you're able to service it, but when you are struggling to meet those kind of obligations, and payroll continues to rise and all those other things. Was this something for the rest that they kind of just didn't want to be left outside the tent? Or was this something that the game, those clubs needed?
I think this raises a very interesting question. And one of the things that's emerged is although this is seen as an American idea, it seems fairly clear that the prime mover behind this was Florentino Perez at Real Madrid. And it also seems clear that Italian and Spanish fans did not react nearly as negatively as the English fans to this. And that, I think, does reflect, for example, when was AC Milan last in the Champions League? Though many of those, those Italian and Spanish clubs are actually struggling to keep up with the Premier League juggernaut. They're facing severe financial crises. And so in some ways, it was the last chance. Maybe they saw this as the last chance to try and achieve some parity, through changing the structure of competition. Why the English clubs wanted to join, I think, is big. So to say that again, in some ways it was about fear for those clubs, whereas for the English clubs, I think it was more about opportunity. It was more about, there's a lot of money to be made here. There's a lot of attractive games, and we can secure our long-term future through this. So they had an incentive to do it, but it wasn't so much fear as opportunity, if you like.
Do you think that they underestimated the backlash, or they were prepared for a backlash? But I mean, the video apology from John Henry is very much out of character of what we've seen previously, whether it's with the Red Sox or Liverpool. He's notoriously camera shy, but this seemed like and the very kind of the immediacy of it as well. After this was falling to bits very quickly, all pointed to this being something which they weren't expecting. Do you think that caught them by surprise? Or is it simply a case of when the broadcasters started to turn their noses up at it, that was when it really became a problem?
I think, as you say, they were expecting a backlash, but they didn't expect it to be significant. I think their calculation was very much like the project big picture that Arsenal and that Liverpool and Manchester United were responsible for advancing back last September and October. They thought that once the dust settled, they would make a financial offer to the other Premier League clubs and possibly to clubs in the Championship and lower to cover the losses that these clubs are enduring due to COVID, and that would buy them off, and that therefore any UEFA threatened sanctions would just vanish, because UEFA could threaten to boycott the 12 or 15 clubs in the Super League, but they couldn't really threaten to boycott the whole of English football. That just is not credible. And so they miscalculated. I think they miscalculated how immediate and how intense the backlash was. Although it's probably worth saying, John Henry does actually have a bit of a track record of apologizing. I mean, he's apologized to the Red Sox before for poor performance of the team, and I think he apologized once for the poor performance of the Liverpool team. So he's a little bit different, I think, from the Glazers and Stan Kroenke at Arsenal, who have the thickest skins that one can imagine, and clearly really don't care what anybody else thinks.
No, we've seen that. I mean, all three of the US owners who were involved in this Super League plan all own American sports franchises. I mean, the Kroenke and the Glazers own NFL franchises. I think it's the Raiders and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, respectively. I think, and obviously the Red Sox for FSG. But while we've seen kind of the Glazers on the pitch celebrating the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' success in the Super Bowl fairly recently, it seems hard to imagine they'd be afforded the same kind of welcome relationship on the pitch. Should there be success for United, whereas John Henry was he was in Madrid to witness the Champions League final victory. Do you think that he has been burnt more badly than the other two as a part of this? Because do you think ultimately he cares what the fans think, or is it just a kind of a false display of contrition?
So I should make a sort of personal confession here. I've actually met John Henry a couple of times and talked about the nature of football. He liked Soccernomics and he liked some of the stuff that I'd written, so he wanted to chat about it. And what I took from him is that he's a little different in the sense that, I mean, he's a billionaire, many times over, and so like the Glazers and like Kroenke, he lives in a somewhat isolated world. And which is one reason why I think he underestimated the reaction. But having made his billions in the financial markets, he really has gone into this as a hobby, which is a little bit different from Kroenke and the Glazers, I think, where they are really more committed in some ways to running money-making businesses. John Henry sees this as something where even if he loses all of his money, then it's not really going to hurt him that much because he's got plenty of money elsewhere. And I was very struck. I was looking back through a quote in an article about him written in October last year with, again, this Project Big Picture, which again was a fundamental miscalculation on the part of Liverpool and Manchester United as well. And but before it collapsed, he obviously was allowed himself to be interviewed for that article, and what he was saying was he was disappointed by the other Premier League owners of the non outside of the big clubs because of their lack of ambition. And he had this quote about them: they're always looking down and not looking up. And it strikes me that's very, very American way of thinking about things. Americans are all about looking up. Forget the past, forget the history. Let's go out and make something better. That's what America. That's the whole sort of American mindset. Whereas I think we in Europe, in Britain, tend to be a little bit more traditionalist. We actually like to preserve our traditions. We like things going on the way that they have done, certainly in our sports. And I do think that highlights difference. So I think his miscalculation was not so much. It wasn't so much about just making money. I'm not trying to pretend he doesn't like making money. He obviously does like making money, but it was also something. It was more about a miscalculation about what the structure of sports meant, or the structure of football meant to English fans and to the country as a whole. And one thing that's striking is, it wasn't just fans; it was everybody. Could you find anybody in the UK to have one positive word to say about this? I think that's kind of what shocked him.
Do you think, you touched on it there, you think it may be more of a hobby to him than say Kroenke and the Glazers? Manchester United has effectively been a cash machine for the Glazer family for a considerable amount of time. Do you think that FSG would be more susceptible to maybe selling the club in that respect, or is this something which just isn't on the agenda, and the kind of these John Henry will have a thicker skin than that? Because ultimately, since they've taken over their £300 million outlay, has grown into a £2 billion business. And as that asset continues to appreciate in value, if indeed it does post-pandemic, surely they'd be willing to hold on because they'd feel that they'd get more benefit out of it that way.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. So first, it's a few years since I met John Henry, so I don't know where his mind is about this kind of thing now. So I don't have any personal insight into that. But I think it's also important to bear in mind FSG is not just John Henry, right? So there are other people, and they will have views about whether they want to stay in it. I suspect it's I think it's very, very unlikely in the short term that John Henry or FSG would want to sell up. It's hard. If this Super League thing will blow over to some extent, at least in due course, so I think they will probably be, their calculation will probably be, we'll still have the business going forward. I do think that if John Henry thought he was no longer enjoying it, that it was no longer any fun, I think he'd be much more willing to sell out. I don't think he's tied to it. It's not, again, as you say, for the Glazers and Kroenke, this is just making money hand over fist, and they love doing that. And I'm not sure that that's so true about John Henry. And if for example, he felt that he couldn't go to a Champions League final, or because of fan animosity, I think it might get to the stage where he thought, what's it worth? But the other thing to say is as long as these teams continue to be perceived as being of such immense financial value. Sorry, my cat's joining in.
Hello, welcome.
He has views too, but he doesn't read enough, so it's not. They're there to be ignored mostly. He would. As I say, I think he would be unlikely to withdraw as long as these teams are perceived to be of such enormous value in the market.
Just changing tack slightly, do you think it was this has kind of raised the questions of people looking at football in a different way? Certainly in this country, maybe I don't know whether it's a flash in the pan kind of train of thought, but obviously people are coming out now saying football as a whole is almost broken in terms of what we know and what the traditions it was kind of based upon. Do you think that this will change the way we approach the game, or is it only going to ever head in kind of one trajectory?
Well, one of the things that's always struck me about English football is, and which I have been studying for 30 years. So I've been studying 30 years a game that has become in that period just immensely successful as a global dominant powerful football nation, if you will. So, I mean, go back 30 years. I mean, the first division as it was by no means the best league in Europe. It was a long way behind Italy, Serie A. It was not as good as Spain or Germany, and all of England's best players were going to play abroad after the 1990 World Cup because that's where the money was. It was just after Hillsborough. English stadiums it was recognized that there was a fundamental crisis in the English game with the quality of the stadiums, the quality of the environments. Hooliganism was rife and causing really turning off people from going to the game. So in 30 years, English football has gone from being effectively on its knees to being on top of the world. And yet we moan about this endlessly. We complain and say, oh, it's terrible and it used to be better. And, I remember what English football was like in the 70s and 80s. I got to tell you, I'm old enough to say I really do not see how it was better back then. It may have been cheaper, but it was really not an experience to savor, in my view. Even if Liverpool dominated completely in that time. I think. So is that going to change? Are we going to change our perception? Or we're going to be perpetually unhappy about the nature of football in England, whatever happens? I think, again, over the years, there have been many, many calls to bring in a regulator who would somebody who would a government-appointed person who would have some say and therefore be able to prevent things like this happening. In some ways, the government might be tempted to respond to that at the moment because it would be immensely popular right now to do such a thing. However, I think it's unlikely in the sense that if you stop to think about it, if we had a government regulator of football, whenever anything went wrong in football, which it always does, it would be the government's fault. So the government would be creating a millstone around its neck, which would never go away. So I suspect that actually, for at least, we'll see what this government review leads to. But my feeling is that in the short term, we're not likely to see any fundamental change, largely because English football still is on top of the world.
While there is the kind of likes of FSG and the Glazers and Stan Kroenke have been behind this, can you see, if not get their way with this, something like salary caps being introduced across European football as a way to, because that was one of the proposals, wasn't it, through the Super League, in order to keep that element of competitiveness between the clubs that would be competing, there would be a cap. It would have to be a hard cap, you'd assume, because if it was a luxury tax, say, as you have in baseball, then it'd be quite easy for Chelsea or Manchester City to permanently pay those kind of fines, more so than it would be for others like Liverpool, possibly. But can you see a salary cap as a way, the future of football, or some kind of collective bargaining agreement like we see in the NFL with players? Do you think that's something which is a potential to arrive in European football?
Well, I think if it did, it would be disastrous for European football. And so one of the things that distinguishes football in Europe from sports leagues in North America is that effectively the leagues in North America are run as a kind of a cartel, where the leagues manage the clubs basically agree not to be economic competitors. So they agree not to try. And so I live now 50 miles west of Detroit. So my local NFL team is the Detroit Lions. They have been lousy for half a century because every season there's no incentive for them to win anything. They just are a lousy team in the NFL. They wait for the good teams to come to them and provide them with entertainment. And, Detroit Lions fans are permanently disappointed. And that's the sort of thing you get with the salary cap, is that you diminish the incentive to make any effort to try to win. And one of the things that's great about English football is that the teams are constantly trying to win. Whatever level they're at, they're trying to go up. Now, of course, that can also lead to financial crises. But one of the things I never understood about the fan concerns about financial crises is that whilst it's bad news for the people who own the clubs if the club gets into financial difficulties, it's not as if the clubs ever disappear. The clubs are always revived, and often they're revived by the fans themselves, who then get to have some say in running their club, particularly at the lower levels. So within that system, I mean, I don't really care if rich people lose some money. It doesn't really bother me as long as they're trying to produce the best possible entertainment for me through putting money into the clubs. Then that's a good thing. So whilst I do think it's likely that the big clubs will look for more and more financial restraints, all that's going to do is help them make more and more money. And I personally do not want to be part of sanctioning that. I don't see why we want them to make more money.
In your Money and Football book, we spoke about this when we were chatting just before the podcast. I mean, one of the themes on the front was why Chievo and Scunthorpe United will never win the Champions League, and why Real Madrid can't be stopped at that level of football. I mean, do you think that the drawbridge is kind of being pulled up now to the rest of those sides who maybe have aspirations of joining Liverpool and the rest of that? We say big six. I mean, effectively, there's you could argue it's almost turned into a big eight, I suppose. But do you think that before long it will be a complete closed shop, and the likes of Everton, who've had considerable spend under Farhad Moshiri to try and bridge that gap in the short term before these reforms of 2024 arrive with the Champions League? Do you think we're heading to a point whereby it will be a totally closed shop anyway, regardless of the European Super League?
Well, my mother was from Scunthorpe. And so when I was a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s, on a Saturday afternoon, you'd always have the radio and listening to the football results. And as a family, we'd sit around and listen to see how Scunthorpe had done. And it was, never great news, to be honest with you. But I all my life, I've said, people said, which team do you support? And I've said Scunthorpe United. And so I've seen them throughout the years. And there is no golden age of Scunthorpe football. There is no such thing. We've had Ian Botham and Ray Clements, Kevin Keegan. We've got lots of great players, but never been in the top division. Never happened. Been in the second tier a couple of times, but usually it's just a few years, and then we go down. And basically we bounce around between the third and fourth levels, and that's permanent. And yet I still think, one day it could happen. There's no reason to think that it couldn't happen. And that I think is the nature of the pyramid system in football, is that it has always been the case that big clubs have dominated at the top. Liverpool, obviously, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is a great example. Obviously, Manchester United, since forever, Arsenal. We've seen the same teams dominate time and again, and that's true in every country. If you look in pretty much every football country, it's been the same. Real Madrid and Barcelona have dominated the Spanish league since it was founded in the 1930s. It's always been true. So we're not entering really an era of new dominance. We're continuing the same dominance that's always been present. Maybe it's statistically you can find a slight tightening, a slight intensity, but not, I would argue, to the point where you would say it's a fundamental change. And I think for most of us that's fine. The thing about humans is psychologically we are predisposed to be optimistic. So no matter how much statistics tells me Scunthorpe cannot make it to the Premier League, I still think they could. I still think it could happen. And of course, we do see with Leicester City. Leicester City was bankrupt in 2002 in the League Two in 2000 League One in 2009, and Premier League champions in 2016. It's an extremely rare and unique event, but nonetheless, it happens to somebody. And it's the same as buying a lottery ticket. People buy lottery tickets. And I want to make a comparison here with the United States as well and baseball. Because if you go back, so in baseball in the United States, there are 30 teams in Major League Baseball. There are a bunch of minor league teams that are almost all controlled by the major league teams. They use them they're called farm teams. They're used for player development. They play meaningless games in meaningless leagues, and almost nobody goes to watch. Well, people do go to watch, but they don't go to watch the baseball because it's really not interesting and there's no significance. And yet, in the 1920s and 30s, 100 years ago, there were up to 40 different independent minor leagues operating in the United States. And they all vanished. They all failed. Pretty much any town in the United States of any size had a minor league team once, but it's gone. Why is it gone? Well, when TV and radio came along, people could watch better quality sport on and were drawn to that. And that led to a decline in audiences in the minor leagues. And because there was never a system of promotion and relegation, there was no hope that things might get better. So when the team got into difficulty, nobody in the town stood up and said, you know what, we need to save this because one day we could be in Major League Baseball. You could never be in Major League Baseball. So the things just died. And that's what I think that's what last week was about, in my view. And that's what was saved. And that's what people should want to cling on to in our football system above all else, I think.
Absolutely. I'm on board with that. As a Chester fan, I hold out the hope that they that getting back in the Football League would be nice as opposed to win the Premier League. But
it will happen.
You are the eternal optimist. For the future of sports ownership, and do you see us moving towards kind of the North American model of sports ownership, or how do you see it playing out over the next 10 years? Because we've already had FSG last month state that they are heading into what they describe as FSG 3.0. So it's the kind of the third decade of sports ownership for FSG, which looks different in the last decade, and that last decade looked different to the decade before in terms of, because technology advances, different revenue streams come on board, don't they? I mean, where do you see the future of sports ownership heading?
Well, so probably first to acknowledge that I'm an economist by profession. So whatever I forecast, probably the opposite is going to happen, right? I mean, we're not known for our quality of our forecast. So with that caveat, one thing that strikes me is that the thing to watch is the how Major League Soccer in the United States develops relative to the big leagues in Europe. So one of the things you might say that Europe is in trouble and its system doesn't work. But Major League Soccer in the United States is struggling to take off with TV audiences. They have managed to expand the number of teams quite significantly, and they have fairly strong local fan support, although it's patchy in a number of places. But it's almost all about people going to the game. There's almost nobody watches this stuff on TV. And in fact, the audience in the United States for the Premier League is way bigger than for Major League Soccer. Now, if Major League Soccer managed to develop and become a serious rival to the European leagues, then because it is organized on a closed league basis, then I think you would see in fact a fundamental shift towards that structure and that style. And you might see, Major League Soccer in that way could ultimately become what the Premier League is today, the dominant league in the world. I frankly doubt that that's a likely scenario. I think Major League Soccer will continue to struggle to attract interest on TV in the United States, and I think the European system is pretty robust. But nothing is guaranteed. What we saw last week was an attempt by very powerful people to try to dismantle the system. They failed, but the Super League idea and the idea of a closed Super League has been around for a long time, and I wouldn't surprise me if it came back. Not next week, but once the dust has settled enough, once people have forgotten, I think there'll be another attempt.
Well, Stefan, that seems like a perfect note to end our conversation on. Thanks very much for joining us today. That's all we have time for on today's podcast. So a huge thank you to Stefan for taking the time to join us and share your insights. And I strongly recommend some of your reading material. Money on Football specifically is what I'm reading at the moment. Copy right here. So we'll have all the analysis over the next few days on the Liverpool ECHO as to Liverpool's accounts and also the continued fallout from the European Super League proposals. If you've not signed up to the Blood Red newsletter yet, make sure you do that via the link in the description. But until next time on the Bottom Line podcast, it's goodbye for now, and thanks for joining us.